I never thought I'd write this down, but the nightmares haven't stopped. The scratching sound is always there, just under the surface of my thoughts, even when I'm wide awake. If I write it all out, maybe I can convince myself that it was all just a horrible misunderstanding. Or maybe someone else will read this and make sense of it in a way I can't. It started a year ago when I bought the old house on Birchwood Lane. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a quiet place to start fresh after a brutal breakup and an even more brutal few years at work. The house had been on the market for years, its peeling paint and sagging porch turning most buyers away. But I saw potential. It had charm, history. I didn't care about the rumors. Yes, I'd heard the stories. That the original owner disappeared without a trace, that neighbors reported strange noises coming from the house even when it was empty. I thought it was all just small-town gossip, the kind of thing people say to make their lives feel less ordinary. The first few weeks were uneventful, filled with the monotony of unpacking and fixing the countless little things that had gone wrong with the house over the years. I was too tired most nights to notice much of anything beyond the aching in my back and the constant buzz of my phone from work emails. But then the noises started. At first, it was subtle, just faint creaks in the night, like the house was settling. I chalked it up to old wood and cold weather. But soon, it became harder to ignore. The creaks turned into knocks, and the knocks became something more deliberate. It wasn't random anymore. It was rhythmic, almost like a pattern. The first time I really noticed, it was late one Friday night. I'd just finished binge-watching some show, and I was lying on the couch, half asleep, when I heard it. 3 knocks, a pause, and then 2 more. It was coming from the wall directly behind me. I froze, my heart racing. It's just the plumbing, I told myself. Or maybe an animal in the walls. I didn't want to think about it too much. I turned up the TV and tried to drown it out. But it didn't stop. Over the next few days, the knocking became more frequent. It wasn't always the same pattern, but it always felt intentional. Like someone or something was trying to communicate. I started losing sleep. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound. And it always came. Sometimes it was soft, almost apologetic. Other times, it was so loud it made the picture frames on my walls rattle. I called a pest control company, convinced I had rats or maybe a raccoon trapped somewhere. The guy who came out spent hours inspecting every nook and cranny of the house. When he was done, he shrugged and said he couldn't find anything. No signs of rodents, no nests, nothing, he said, looking genuinely baffled. This place is cleaner than most houses I've seen. I wanted to believe him, but the knocking didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. And then there was the smell. It started as a faint, musty odor like damp wood. But over time, it grew stronger, more pungent. It reminded me of decaying leaves or rotting meat. I searched the house from top to bottom, looking for the source. I even checked the crawl space under the house, but I couldn't find anything. One night, after a particularly bad bout of knocking, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a hammer, I pried open one of the walls where the sound seemed loudest. My heart pounded as I pulled away the drywall, expecting to find a dead animal or maybe some old, rotting pipes. But there was nothing, just empty space. At least, that's what I thought at first. But then I noticed the writing. Faint, almost imperceptible, there were words scratched into the wooden beams inside the wall. I leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. The words were jagged and uneven, like they'd been carved with something blunt. And they weren't in English. I took pictures and spent the rest of the night trying to translate them. After hours of searching online, I finally found something that matched. The language was Latin, and the phrase roughly translated to, "They listen. They wait." I should have left right then and there. Packed my bags, sold the house, and never looked back. But I didn't. I told myself it was probably some weird graffiti left by a previous owner. Maybe kids messing around. That was easier to believe than the alternative. But the knocking grew louder, and the smell grew stronger. And then the voices started. They were faint at first, just whispers I could almost convince myself were in my head. But over time, they became clearer. I'd hear them in the dead of night, a low murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sometimes it sounded like a single voice, other times like a chorus. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, angry. One night, I woke to the sound of my name being whispered. It was so close, like someone was leaning right over me. My blood ran cold as I shot upright in bed, fumbling for the light. But there was no one there, just the dark, empty room. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I started sleeping in my car or crashing at friends' places. But no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed. The knocking would find me, faint and distant at first, but always growing louder. And the voices, they were with me now, a constant, maddening presence that wouldn't leave me alone. I finally decided to do some research on the house. I needed answers, something to explain what was happening. What I found still haunts me. The house had been built in the early 1900s by a man named William Grayson. He was a reclusive scholar, obsessed with the occult. According to old newspaper articles, he'd claimed the house was built on a convergence of energies and had designed it as a sort of amplifier. No one knew what he meant, but neighbors reported strange rituals and gatherings at the house. And then one day he vanished. No one ever saw him again. The house passed through several owners over the years, but none stayed for long. There were whispers of disappearances, of people losing their minds. The final straw for me came 2 nights ago. I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book, when the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't just in the walls. It was on the windows, the ceiling, the floor. It was everywhere. And then the voices joined in, louder than they'd ever been. They were shouting now, a cacophony of anger and fear. I ran out of the house and didn't look back. I'm staying in a motel now, trying to figure out what to do. I know I can't go back, but I can't escape it either. The knocking is still there, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat in the distance. And the whispers, they followed me here. I don't know how this ends. Maybe I'm losing my mind. Or maybe there's something in that house, something that won't let me go. All I know is that I'm scared, and I'm not sure I can outrun it. The motel was meant to be a refuge, but it wasn't. The walls here were thin, and the cheap fluorescent light flickered like it was mocking my fear. At first, I thought the knocking was in my head, a cruel echo of what I'd left behind in the house. But when the man in the next room banged on the wall and shouted, "Keep it down," I knew it wasn't just me. Whatever was in that house had followed me. The whispers were worse. They seemed to ebb and flow, like waves crashing against the edges of my sanity. Sometimes they were distant, faint enough to ignore if I concentrated hard enough. But other times they were so loud, so insistent, that I could swear they were inside my skull. I tried to leave the motel. I packed my car with what little I had brought with me and drove aimlessly, hoping distance would help. But the knocking came with me, tapping softly against the dashboard as if mocking my escape. The whispers whispered my name. They spoke in broken English now, fragmented sentences that made no sense, but carried a heavy weight of despair. Come home. Help them. I didn't want to go back to the house. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, to abandon it and never look back. But the further I drove, the stronger the pull became. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, a gnawing sensation that I couldn't shake. By the time I found myself parked in front of the house, it was past midnight. The street was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your own breathing seem too loud. The house loomed before me, its broken windows like dark eyes watching my every move. I didn't remember unlocking the door or stepping inside, but suddenly I was there, standing in the middle of the living room. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of decay. The whispers surged around me, louder now, more desperate. Help us! I turned on my flashlight and moved toward the wall where I'd first heard the knocking. The drywall was still torn away, the faint Latin words carved into the beams staring back at me like an accusation. And then I saw it, a faint glimmer, like light reflecting off something metallic deep within the wall. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but the whispers urged me forward. With trembling hands, I pried away more of the wall. The smell grew stronger, and my stomach churned, but I couldn't stop. The whispers filled my head, their tone shifting from desperate to insistent. And then I found it. A door. It was small, barely big enough for a child to crawl through, hidden behind layers of wood and plaster. The edges were rusted, but the door itself was intact, as if it had been preserved for years. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming at me to leave, to run. But the whispers wouldn't let me. Open it. My hands moved on their own, gripping the rusted handle. It took all my strength to pull it open, the hinges screeching like a dying animal. Beyond the door was darkness, thick, impenetrable darkness that seemed to swallow the light of my flashlight. And then I heard it. Not whispers this time, but a voice. Clear and sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Don't! I froze, my hand still on the door. The voice was different from the others, calm, measured, and undeniably human. I turned, my flashlight sweeping the room, but there was no one there. Close the door, the voice said again. and this time it was louder, more insistent. "You don't know what you're doing. Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. Silence. And then the whispers returned, louder than ever, drowning out the voice. They surged around me, a chaotic storm of sound that made my head throb. "Open the way. Free us." I turned back to the door, the darkness inside beckoning me like an open wound. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move, something impossibly large, shifting in the shadows. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers screamed in protest, their once pleading tone now filled with rage. "Coward! Traitor!" I stumbled back, tripping over debris and falling to the floor. The whispers grew fainter, retreating back into the walls, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive. I don't remember how I got out of the house. The next thing I knew, I was back in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. That voice, whoever or whatever it was, had saved me. I was sure of it. But from what? And why? Now, as I sit here writing this, I can still feel the pull of the house. It's like a weight pressing on my chest, a constant reminder that I've left something unfinished. I don't want to go back, but I know I will, because whatever's in that house isn't done with me yet. I spent the next 2 days in a daze, holed up in another motel miles away from Birchwood Lane. Sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that door and the darkness behind it. Worse, I could hear the whispers even now, faint and distant, but always there. I wasn't sure if they were in my head or if they'd truly followed me. Then there was the voice, the calm, measured warning that had stopped me from opening the door. It haunted me almost as much as the whispers. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, it was, they were trying to protect me. But from what? I decided to look deeper into William Grayson's history. I couldn't go back to the house without understanding more about what I was facing. My laptop battery was nearly dead, so I headed to the local library. The librarian, a kind older woman named Clara, didn't even blink when I asked for information about the house. "Birchwood Lane, huh?" she said, her voice tinged with concern. "You're not the first to come looking for answers about that place." Clara led me to a corner of the library where old town records were kept. I spent hours sifting through dusty newspapers and brittle documents. What I found made my blood run cold. William Grayson had been more than just a reclusive scholar. He'd been part of a secretive occult society known as the Circle of the Veil. They believed in tapping into the hidden energies of the world, and according to the records, Grayson had claimed the land on Birchwood Lane was a gateway. A gateway to what, though wasn't clear. But the disappearances were. Grayson wasn't the only one who had vanished. Over the decades, multiple residents of the house had gone missing. No bodies were ever found, and no explanations were ever given. One article from the 1970s detailed the disappearance of an entire family, a couple and their 2 children, who had moved into the house. Neighbors reported hearing unearthly noises coming from the property in the nights leading up to their disappearance. I sat back, rubbing my temples. It all sounded too surreal, like something out of a horror movie. But I couldn't ignore the patterns. The house was dangerous. Whatever Grayson had tapped into, whatever he had awakened, it hadn't left. That night, I dreamt of the door again. In my dream, I stood before it, the whispers swirling around me. But this time, the voice wasn't there to stop me. My hand reached out, trembling, and the door creaked open. The darkness inside wasn't empty. It moved. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. I knew what I had to do. By the time I reached the house, it was past midnight. The street was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that made me feel like the world was holding its breath. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand. The air was thicker than before, heavy with that same nauseating smell of decay. The whispers started almost immediately, faint at first, but growing louder with each step I took. The wall where I'd found the door was just as I'd left it, the drywall torn away and the faint Latin carvings staring back at me. But the door itself was different. The rusted metal had begun to glow faintly, a sickly green light pulsing from its edges like a heartbeat. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to end this. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The whispers surged, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a frenzy of emotion. And then amidst the chaos, I heard it again. The calm voice. "Don't open it." I spun around, but the room was empty. "Who are you?" I shouted, the fear in my voice giving way to desperation. "What is this?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the whispers seemed to shift, their tone growing darker, angrier. "Open the way," they demanded. I stepped closer to the door, my flashlight flickering wildly. The green glow pulsed faster, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw shapes moving within the light. They were humanoid but wrong, twisted, grotesque, their forms shifting and writhing like shadows in a storm. "No," I said, stepping back. "I won't." The whispers screamed in unison, their rage shaking the very walls of the house. The door began to rattle, as if something on the other side was trying to break through. And then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I froze, too terrified to turn around. The hand was cold, impossibly cold, and its grip tightened as if warning me not to move. "Leave," the calm voice said, right in my ear. "Now." The door rattled harder, the glow spilling out into the room like liquid light. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted, not looking back, and didn't stop running until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house loomed in the distance, its windows glowing faintly green. I don't know what's behind that door, and I'm not sure I want to. But something tells me this isn't over. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind churned, replaying everything that had happened. The door, the voice, the hand on my shoulder. It all felt like a fever dream, but the lingering chill in my bones told me it was real. The next morning, I resolved to destroy the house. Burn it down if I had to. Whatever was in there needed to be erased. I rented a gas canister from a hardware store and returned to Birchwood Lane one final time. The house stood as it always had, sagging and weathered, yet somehow more menacing than ever. Its windows seemed to follow me as I approached, their cracked glass reflecting the overcast sky like dead eyes. Inside, the air was heavier than before, oppressive and thick with that rotting stench. The whispers started immediately, angry and shrill. They knew why I was there. "Leave," they hissed. "You cannot stop it." I ignored them and began dousing the rooms with gasoline. The floorboards creaked under my weight, the sound echoing through the empty halls like mocking laughter. When I reached the wall with the door, I hesitated. The green glow had returned, stronger than ever, seeping through the cracks like poison. The door rattled violently, as if whatever was on the other side could sense what I was about to do. "Stop," the calm voice commanded, louder than it had ever been. I spun around, searching for its source, but the room was empty. My heart raced as I struck a match, the flame dancing in my trembling hand. "I'm ending this," I whispered, more to myself than to the voice. But as I moved to throw the match, the door exploded open. The light that poured out wasn't green anymore. It was black, a suffocating void that seemed to devour everything it touched. Shapes writhed within it, impossibly large and grotesque, their forms shifting in ways that made my stomach churn. The whispers rose into a deafening roar, a symphony of rage and despair. "You were warned," the calm voice boomed, no longer calm. I stumbled backward, the match falling from my hand and extinguishing on the gasoline-soaked floor. The shadows surged toward me, faster than I could react. And then, everything stopped. The air grew still, the whispers falling silent. The shadows froze, their writhing forms suspended in the air. I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall and thin, with an otherworldly presence that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. His eyes glowed faintly, the same sickly green as the door, but his expression was one of pity. "You've unleashed it," he said, his voice echoing in the empty room. "But it's not too late." "Who are you?" I stammered. "I'm what's left of William Grayson," he said, "or what the house has allowed me to become." I didn't understand, but I didn't have time to ask questions. The shadows began to move again, their forms stretching toward me like claws. Grayson raised a hand, and the void recoiled, but I could see he was struggling. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice strained. "The door is a gateway, not just to another place, but to something far worse than you can imagine. It feeds on fear, on despair, and now that it's been opened, it won't stop." "What do I do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "You can't destroy the house," he said. "You can't destroy it, but you can trap it again." "How?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward the door, his body beginning to dissolve into the same black void that poured from it. "Grayson, wait!" I shouted. "Seal the door," he said, his voice fading as the shadows consumed him. "But know this, you'll never truly escape." With that, he was gone, and the void surged forward. I didn't think. I acted. Grabbing a piece of wood from the floor, I shoved it against the door, forcing it closed. The shadows screamed in protest, their forms thrashing violently, but the door held. I found nails and a hammer in the corner of the room, tools left behind from my earlier renovations, and drove them into the edges of the door, sealing it shut. The whispers returned, softer now, like a dying wind. "Fool," they hissed. "It will find you." As the last nail went in, the glow faded, and the house fell silent. I left Birchwood Lane that night and never looked back. I didn't burn it down. I didn't sell it. I simply disappeared, leaving it to rot, hoping that the seals would hold. But the whispers have never truly left me. Even now, as I write this in a rented apartment thousands of miles away, I can hear them, faint and distant, like a memory I can't escape. And sometimes late at night, I hear the knocking. 3 knocks, a pause, and then 2 more. Whatever's in that house isn't done with me yet. And deep down, I know it never will be.